The neighborhood was designed to look picture perfect. Rows of identical houses stood proudly under the watchful eye of the HOA, their lawns trimmed to the exact same length, their fences painted in uniform shades of beige, and their flower beds manicured as if the flowers themselves had signed a contract. It was the kind of place where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. And in the middle of this pristine setting, one family stood out for reasons beyond their control. Mark and his wife, Emily, had recently moved into the neighborhood with their teenage son, Ryan. Ryan had been in a serious car accident 2 years earlier that left him reliant on a wheelchair. Despite the challenges, the family tried to create as normal a life as possible. The house they bought had all the space they needed, but there was one glaring problem. The front steps. Ryan couldn't get in or out of the house without assistance, and Mark immediately knew that installing a wheelchair ramp was non-negotiable. The day construction began on the ramp, most neighbors didn't notice. A few glanced over curiously, but no one seemed bothered. For Mark, it was simply a matter of giving his son the independence he deserved. But what Mark didn't realize was that one set of eyes was watching very closely, and those eyes belonged to Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA's rules. Karen lived 3 houses down. Her yard was always immaculate, her shutters freshly painted, and her driveway spotless. She thrived on the idea that the neighborhood was her kingdom, and she relished any opportunity to remind others of the HOA's strict guidelines. To her, the sight of a wheelchair ramp, breaking the uniform aesthetic of the block, was an act of rebellion that couldn't be tolerated. At first, Karen's disapproval was subtle. She would linger on her morning walks, staring at the ramp with a sour expression. She would whisper to other neighbors, pointing out how the ramp clashed with the neighborhood's symmetry, and soon enough, those whispers reached Mark. But he brushed them off. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and he wasn't about to prioritize aesthetics over his son's mobility. The ramp was completed within a week. It was sturdy, safe, and matched the color of the house. For the family, it was life-changing. Ryan could roll in and out of the front door on his own, no longer needing to rely on someone to carry him down the steps. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of freedom. But Karen wasn't celebrating. To her, the ramp was an eyesore, a direct violation of what she believed the neighborhood stood for. And when Karen felt something was out of place, she didn't just stew quietly, she acted. It started with a letter. Mark found it stuffed into his mailbox one morning, stamped with the HOA's logo. The letter was curt and formal, stating that unauthorized modifications to property exteriors were not allowed and demanding the removal of the ramp within 14 days. Mark was stunned. Surely, they couldn't expect him to remove a wheelchair ramp. He read the letter 3 times, just to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. His wife Emily was furious, and Ryan, overhearing the conversation, felt crushed. The ramp wasn't just a convenience, it was his independence. Mark decided to confront the HOA directly. He called the office, only to be told that complaints had been lodged, and the letter was standard procedure. He asked who had complained, but they wouldn't tell him. Of course, Mark already suspected the answer. That evening, as Mark wheeled Ryan down the ramp to show him the sunset, Karen walked by with her little dog. She didn't say a word, but the smug look on her face said everything. Mark's suspicions were confirmed. This was Karen's doing. But Mark wasn't going to back down. He knew his rights, and he knew the law. The Fair Housing Act protected families like his from discrimination. Removing the ramp wasn't just unreasonable, it was illegal. He began gathering paperwork, researching regulations, and preparing himself for a battle he hadn't expected to fight when he moved into the neighborhood. As the days passed, the tension grew. Karen doubled down on her campaign, rallying other neighbors with exaggerated claims that the ramp would lower property values. She sent more letters, posted passive-aggressive notes on the community bulletin board, and even took pictures of the ramp as if documenting a crime scene. Some neighbors avoided taking sides, while others quietly sympathized with Mark's family, but were too afraid of Karen's wrath to speak up. One night, Emily found a flyer slipped under their door. It read, "Preserve the beauty of our neighborhood. Say no to unauthorized structures." It wasn't signed, but the tone screamed Karen. Mark realized this wasn't just about the ramp anymore. This was about standing up to a bully who hid behind HOA rules to control everyone around her. He had no intention of letting Karen win. And so, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, a family simply trying to live with dignity and accessibility. On the other, a self-proclaimed enforcer determined to bend everyone to her will. What Karen didn't realize, however, was that by targeting Mark's family, she had made the biggest mistake of her HOA reign. Because Mark wasn't just stubborn, he was determined, and he was about to turn the tables on her in a way she never saw coming. Taramp wasanti going anywhere. And soon, neither was Karen's peace of mind. Mark woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The ramp outside stood proudly in the soft glow of sunrise, a symbol of independence for his son and defiance against those who wanted to strip it away. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, spreading out all the paperwork he had collected the night before, copies of the Fair Housing Act, printed articles on accessibility rights, and a few legal blogs covered the table like armor before a battle. He had spent hours researching, and everything pointed to one conclusion: the HOA was in the wrong. The law was clear. Accessibility accommodations could not be denied, no matter how much Karen and her allies complained about aesthetics. The ramp wasn't just a wooden structure, it was Ryan's lifeline, and Mark wasn't about to let anyone threaten it. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign against the ramp was gaining momentum. She had a knack for rallying people around her, especially those too timid to argue with her directly. She whispered about declining property values, about how slippery slopes could ruin the neighborhood's pristine look. Today, it was a ramp. Tomorrow, it could be solar panels, or ebon warts, brightly painted fences. To her, the ramp was a symbol of chaos in her carefully curated world. By midweek, Mark received another letter from the HOA, this one far more aggressive. It threatened daily fines for every day the ramp remained standing past the deadline. The amount was outrageous, clearly designed to scare him into submission. But instead of folding, Mark felt his resolve harden. He wasn't going to pay a dime. Emily suggested calling a lawyer, and Mark agreed. Within a day, he was on the phone with an attorney who specialized in housing discrimination cases. The lawyer didn't even hesitate. He confirmed what Mark already suspected. The HOA had no legal ground. In fact, their actions bordered on harassment. The lawyer promised to draft a formal response, citing the Fair Housing Act and demanding that the HOA immediately cease their threats. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that Mark had involved legal counsel. Some residents cheered silently, thrilled that someone was finally standing up to Karen. Others kept their distance, too worried about what might happen if they crossed her. But regardless of where they stood, everyone was watching. Karen, of course, was livid. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in her own backyard. She doubled her efforts, sending emails to the entire neighborhood board and even attempting to call an emergency HOA meeting. She painted Mark as a rule breaker, someone who didn't respect the community's values. But beneath her polished tone, there was something more primal: fear. The truth was, Karen's authority had always relied on intimidation. People didn't follow her because they believed in her, they followed her because they were too afraid not to. Mark's resistance was exposing cracks in her control, and the neighborhood was beginning to notice. The standoff grew tense. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks, children repeated fragments of arguments they overheard, and the once quiet street became the stage for a silent but growing conflict. Every day that ramp stood, it was like a banner waving in Karen's face, reminding her that she wasn't as powerful as she thought. Then came the night of the storm. Heavy rain pounded the neighborhood, and wind rattled fences and windows. At dawn, when the storm had finally passed, Mark stepped outside to check the ramp. To his horror, he found deep gouges carved into the wood, as though someone had taken a knife or sharp tool to it. The damage wasn't enough to make it unsafe, but it was clear someone had tried to sabotage it. Mark's gut told him who was behind it. He didn't have proof, but Karen's vendetta had escalated before. Why wouldn't it escalate again? Emily was shaken, Ryan was heartbroken, and Mark was furious. This wasn't just a matter of HOA rules anymore. This was personal. Mark reported the vandalism to the police, filing a report to document the damage. He also installed security cameras around the property, determined to catch whoever dared to come near the ramp again. Karen, of course, acted oblivious, but the way she avoided eye contact whenever Mark passed by spoke volumes. The next HOA meeting finally came, and the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors filled the small community hall, buzzing with anticipation. Karen sat at the head of the table, papers stacked neatly before her, clearly ready to make her case. Mark walked in with his lawyer by his side, and a hush fell over the room. Karen started with her usual polished tone, listing the so-called violations and insisting the ramp had to go. But when Mark's lawyer stood up and began citing federal law, her confidence faltered. The lawyer explained, in no uncertain terms, that the HOA was not only in violation of the law, but also opening itself up to a massive lawsuit if it continued to harass Mark's family. For the first time, Karen didn't have a quick comeback. Her face reddened, her hands trembled as she shuffled her papers. The neighbors watched wide-eyed as the woman who had ruled the community for years suddenly looked small and powerless. But Karen wasn't finished, not yet. She might have been publicly humiliated, but privately, her anger burned hotter than ever. She had lost the first battle, but she wasn't going to lose the war. Mark walked out of the meeting that night, feeling a rush of relief, but also a sense of foreboding. He had won a victory, yes, but he knew Karen well enough to understand that she wasn't done. She was plotting her next move, and if the vandalism was any indication, it was going to get uglier. And as the neighborhood simmered with tension, one thing became painfully clear. The battle over the ramp had escalated into something much bigger. This wasn't just about accessibility anymore, it was about power, control, and pride. Karen wasn't backing down, and neither was Mark. The war was only just beginning. The fallout from the HOA meeting rippled through the neighborhood like shockwaves. For years, Karen had commanded fear and obedience, her word treated as law. But that night, her authority cracked in front of everyone. Mark's lawyer had dismantled her arguments, and the board was forced to acknowledge that the ramp could not, under any circumstance, be removed. For Mark and his family, it was a victory. Ryan felt lighter, finally able to enjoy his freedom without the looming threat of removal. Emily allowed herself to relax, believing that maybe the worst was behind them. But Mark wasn't fooled. Ekno Karen's pride wouldn't let her accept defeat quietly, and he was right. Karen retreated, but not in surrender. In the days that followed, she began working in the shadows, weaponizing the HOA rules in new and creative ways. If se couldn't remove the ramp directly, she would make life unbearable for Mark's family in every other possible way. The first strike came as a violation notice about their lawn. The grass, according to the letter, was overgrown by precisely 2 inches beyond the HOA's standards. Mark measured it, himself it wasn't. Still, he trimmed it even shorter, just to eliminate the excuse. But the next week, another violation appeared, this time claiming their trash bins had been left out for too long after pickup. A day later, it was about the color of their mailbox, then the placement of a flower pot on the porch. It became clear Karen was launching a campaign of harassment, using the HOA as her weapon. Every morning, Mark braced himself for a new notice stuffed in the mailbox or taped to his door. Emily grew more anxious, Ryan grew more frustrated, and Mark's patience wore thin. But instead of lashing out, he meticulously documented everything, every letter, every violation, every false claim. He knew Karen was digging her own grave. All he had to do was collect the evidence. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was divided. Some people, emboldened by seeing Karen lose in the meeting, began quietly voicing support for Mark. A few even stopped by to check on Ryan, offering kind words or slipping encouraging notes into the mailbox. Others, however, fell in line with Karen, either out of loyalty or fear. The street became tense, with whispered conversations and suspicious glances. But Karen wasn't satisfied with paper harassment. She escalated further. One evening, Ryan was practicing maneuvering his wheelchair on the ramp when he noticed something odd, a slick, greasy substance smeared across the wooden boards. Mark rushed over, heart pounding, and realized someone had deliberately poured oil on the ramp. It was a dangerous act. One slip could have caused Ryan serious harm. Mark immediately checked the security cameras he had installed after the storm vandalism. And there it was, blurry footage of a figure in the night, hood pulled up, creeping up the driveway with a bottle in hand. The resolution wasn't perfect, but the posture, the build, the way the figure moved, it all screamed Karen. Mark took the footage to the police, filing another report. The officer listened carefully but explained that unless the footage clearly identified the person, it would be difficult to press charges. Frustrated but undeterred, Mark made copies of the footage and shared them with the HOA board, demanding action. Karen, of course, denied everything. She claimed she had been asleep that night, dismissing the footage as inconclusive. But the damage was done not to the ramp, but to her reputation. Neighbors whispered louder now, their suspicions growing. Still, Karen didn't stop. Her campaign intensified, and soon it wasn't just notice to sit, was fines. Exorbitant, unjustified fines appeared in Mark's HOA account, each one more outrageous than the last. Mark refused to pay, and instead forwarded everything to his lawyer, who was building a case for harassment and discrimination that grew stronger with each passing day. Yet, beneath the chaos, something else was happening. Neighbors who had once feared Karen were beginning to see her for who she really was. The sabotage, the endless notices, the obsession with control, it was painting a picture of a woman consumed by spite. And in that shift, Mark found unexpected allies. One evening, as Mark was outside, repairing the damage on the ramp, his next-door neighbor quietly approached. He admitted he was tired of Karen's bullying too, tired of living in a neighborhood where everyone walked on eggshells. Others, he said, felt the same way. Karen might have been loud, but her support was dwindling. Mark realized then that this fight wasn't just about his ramp anymore. It was about something bigger. Karen's reign of intimidation was collapsing, and the neighborhood was waking up, but Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight. As her grip slipped, she grew more desperate, more reckless. She began plotting something drastic, something that would make the ramp battle look small by comparison. Mark didn't know it yet, but the worst of Karen's attacks was still to come, and when it hit, it would change everything. By the time autumn rolled in, the neighborhood was fractured. The leaves were changing colors, but beneath the picturesque scenery, tension crackled like dry twigs waiting for a spark. Everyone had chosen a side, some quietly siding with Mark, others clinging to Karen's influence out of habit or fear. The once friendly block was now a battleground of silent stares and whispered judgments. Karen felt the shift more than anyone. Her empire of control was crumbling. The HOA board, once eager to enforce her every whim, had grown cautious after Mark's lawyer's warnings. Neighbors who used to jump at her commands now gave her half-hearted nods or avoided her altogether. The power that had once defined her life was slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't stand it. Desperation has a way of driving people to extremes, and Karen was no exception. She decided if she couldn't win through rules and regulations, she would stage something so dramatic, so manipulative, that it would turn the neighborhood against Mark for good. It began with whispers. Karen hinted to anyone who would listen that the ramp was unsafe not because of its design, but because of carelessness. She spread rumors that Ryan had nearly rolled into the street because Mark hadn't supervised him properly. She told others that the ramp was lowering home values because buyers don't want to live next to constant reminders of accidents and lawsuits. Her words were cruel, but she spoke them with such conviction that some began to question what they knew. But rumors alone weren't enough. Karen needed proof, or at least something that looked like proof. Late one night, she acted. Dressed in dark clothes, she crept across the street with a hammer and nails. Her plan was reckless, to sabotage the ramp enough that it would cause an accident, then blame Mark for negligence. She crouched low, working quickly, her heart pounding as she loosened a bolt and wedged a nail at an angle to trip a wheel. She was so focused that she didn't notice the faint red glow of a security camera trained directly on her. The next morning, Ryan went to use the ramp, but Mark had developed a habit of checking it first. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. He noticed the loose bolt, the out-of-place nail, and his stomach sank. He rushed inside to check the camera footage, and there she was, Karen, caught in crystal-clear detail, tampering with the ramp under the cover of darkness. Mark felt a mix of anger and grim satisfaction. This was the proof he had been waiting for. No more blurry shadows or suspicious behavior. This was undeniable evidence. He immediately copied the footage and sent it to his lawyer, then to the police. This time, there would be no brushing it off as inconclusive. When the officers arrived at Karen's door, the entire neighborhood watched. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, and neighbors peeked from porches as Karen stood frozen on her doorstep, arms crossed in defiance, but face pale with shock. She tried to argue, tried to twist the story into a misunderstanding, but the footage was irrefutable. The officers warned her sternly and informed her that tampering with the ramp could be considered endangerment, especially since it was built for a disabled resident. For the first time, Karen wasn't the accuser, she was the accused. But even this humiliation didn't break her. Instead, it hardened her. Karen became erratic, more unpredictable than ever. She stopped walking her dog at her usual times, stopped attending casual gatherings, and when she did appear, her eyes darted nervously as though everyone was against her, which, in truth, they were. Yet, in her mind, she convinced herself she was the victim. She told anyone still willing to listen that the footage had been staged, that Mark had doctored it to frame her. She painted herself as the target of a conspiracy, weaving wild stories that only alienated her further. Meanwhile, Mark's lawyer prepared to escalate. With the mounting evidence of harassment, vandalism, and now sabotage, they were building a case strong enough to bring the HOA to its knees on, possibly Karen with it. The neighborhood reached a boiling point. Some residents demanded Karen be removed from the HOA board altogether, claiming she had embarrassed and endangered them all. Others insisted on waiting, too afraid of her retaliation. The board scheduled an emergency vote, one that would determine not only Karen's future, but the direction of the entire neighborhood. Karen knew what was coming. She could feel the walls closing in, and in her desperation, she devised her boldest move yet. If the neighborhood wanted a show, she would give them one. She planned to turn the emergency meeting into a spectacle, to expose Mark and his family in front of everyone with one final, desperate attempt at regaining control. What Karen didn't know, however, was that Mark was already 3 steps ahead. He and his lawyer were prepared, and the evidence they held was about to do more than just clear his name, it was going to destroy hers. The stage was set. The neighborhood was divided, the board was on edge, and everyone knew the upcoming meeting would not be just another argument about lawn care or mailbox colors. It would be the climax of a war that had started with a simple wheelchair ramp, and when the dust settled, only one side would remain standing. The evening of the emergency HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere around the community hall was charged with anticipation. For weeks, the entire neighborhood had been caught in the tug-of-war between Mark and Karen. Now, everyone expected the confrontation to finally reach its breaking point. Neighbors filed into the hall in clusters, whispering in low tones, their eyes darting between Mark's family and Karen. It felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like the audience gathering for a trial. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes people sit a little straighter in their chairs, unsure of what they are about to witness. Karen arrived early, striding into the hall with her head high, clutching a thick folder of papers and photographs. Her expression was one of false confidence. Her lips pressed into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had been working tirelessly in secret, gathering every scrap of ammunition she could muster to turn the tide back in her favor. To Karen, this was her last stand. Mark entered a few minutes later, his lawyer by his side. Emily followed, with Ryan rolling in behind them, his wheelchair moving smoothly down the aisle. Conversations hushed at the sight of the family, and for the first time, it seemed clear to everyone just what was at stake. This wasn't about lawn lengths or mailbox paint. This was about dignity, safety, and fairness. The meeting began with the board chair calling everyone to order. His voice wavered slightly. He knew the room was ready to explode at the first spark. Karen immediately seized the moment, standing tall with her folder and launching into a speech. She spoke passionately, accusing Mark of undermining the aid, of manipulating the neighborhood against her, of staging the sabotage video to frame her. She waved photos of the ramp, zoomed in shots of nails, angles of wood grain, meaningless details she claimed proved her innocence. Her words spilled out rapidly, each more desperate than the last. She painted herself as the true victim, claiming she had been harassed and humiliated, her reputation destroyed by lies. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others rolled their eyes, weary of her theatrics. But Karen wasn't done. She saved her boldest claim for last. With a dramatic flourish, she held up a paper and declared that Mark had built the ramp without the proper permits. She insisted it was unsafe, a liability waiting to cause an accident that would cost the HOA millions in lawsuits. She demanded its immediate removal, not on aesthetic grounds this time, but on the grounds of public safety. For a moment, the room was silent. It was the moment Karen had been waiting for, the hush of uncertainty, the flicker of doubt in the air. She believed she had finally regained control. But then Mark's lawyer stood, calm/steady and deliberate. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick binder. Inside were copies of every legal document, every letter, every piece of evidence collected over the past few months. He began to speak, not with emotion, but with precision. He confirmed that the ramp had been built with the proper permits, inspected, and approved by city officials. He cited the Fair Housing Act, reminding the board and everyone present that accessibility modifications were federally protected. He explained that not only was the HOA's campaign against the ramp unlawful, but Karen's actions documented through letters, fines, and the sabotage footage constituted harassment and discrimination. Then came the moment that silenced even Karen. The lawyer presented the video footage. This time, it wasn't blurry or grainy. The high-resolution clip played on a projector screen for all to see. Karen, in the dead of night, crouching on Mark's ramp with tools in hand, tampering with the bolts. The entire room gasped in unison. Some neighbors muttered under their breath. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Karen's face drained of color. The lawyer didn't stop there. He displayed copies of police reports, violation notices, and photographs of oil poured across the ramp. He laid out the pattern of harassment, piece by piece, until the evidence was overwhelming. Karen's empire of intimidation collapsed right there in the community hall, exposed under the harsh light of truth. The board members looked grim. One leaned forward and announced that a motion would be held immediately to remove Karen from her position on the HOA board. Applause erupted from several corners of the room, hesitant at first, then louder as more neighbors joined in. For years, Karen had ruled through fear. But now, emboldened by the truth, the neighborhood was finally turning against her. Karen tried to shout over the noise, claiming it was all lies, that she had been set up, that everyone was conspiring against her. But her voice was drowned out by the collective frustration of neighbors who had endured her tyranny for far too long. Mark remained calm through it all, his hand resting on Ryan's wheelchair. He didn't need to raise his voice or gloat. The evidence had spoken louder than any words could. For him, this wasn't about revenge, was about protecting his family and finally ending the nightmare. When the vote was cast, the result was decisive. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board. The chair announced it with a firm voice, and the room erupted again, this time with cheers and relief. It was over. Or, at least, it should have been. As neighbors left the hall, exchanging smiles and congratulations with Mark and his family, Karen sat alone at the table, clutching her folder of useless papers. Her empire was gone, her reputation shattered, her power stripped away. But the look in her eyes wasn't one of defeat, it was one of seething resentment. Karen had lost her crown, but Mark knew better than to believe she was finished. People like Karen didn't fade quietly into the background. They burned with vengeance, waiting for their next chance to strike. And, in the days to come, Mark would learn that Karen still had one last move to make, a move that could threaten everything he had fought to protect. The neighborhood was different after the meeting. For the first time in years, people walked their dogs without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Children played outside without being hushed about the rules. Neighbors stopped by Mark's house to congratulate him, some even apologizing for not standing up sooner. The ramp, once a source of conflict, had become a symbol of resistance against tyranny. But beneath the calm surface, something darker lingered. Everyone knew Karen wouldn't accept her downfall quietly. She had spent too many years ruling through intimidation, too much of her identity wrapped up in her authority. Losing her HOA seat hadn't humbled her, it had enraged her. And when someone like Karen burned with anger, it was only a matter of time before the flames spread. At first, she vanished. For nearly a week, her house looked deserted, curtains stayed drawn, her driveway empty, her pristine lawn untended. Neighbors whispered theories: had she moved out? Gone on vacation? Was she finally too embarrassed to show her face? Mark wanted to believe it was over, but deep down Ek knew better. The truth came one chilly evening. Mark was in the living room when he heard a loud thud outside. He rushed to the front door, heart pounding, and found a rock lying at the base of the ramp. Attached to it was a note scrawled in angry handwriting. "This isn't over." Emily gasped when she read it. Ryan looked terrified, and Mark's hands clenched into fists. The evidence was obvious, but without a signature, it was just another shadow of Karen's spite. Mark tightened security even further, adding motion lights and reinforcing the cameras. He refused to let fear drive his family back into silence. The following day, the neighborhood woke to chaos. Spray painted across Mark's garage door in bright red letters were the words, "Rule Breaker." It was crude, childish, but unmistakably Karen's work. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, some shaking their heads, others snapping photos. The police came once again, documenting the vandalism, but without catching her in the act, their hands were tied. Karen was spiraling, lashing out in desperation. The more she tried to scare Mark's family, the more isolated she became. Neighbors who had once tolerated her now openly spoke against her. They offered to help clean the graffiti, donated supplies, and even volunteered to keep watch at night. For the first time, the community wasn't afraid of Karen. They were united against her. Still, Karen wasn't finished. She wanted a grand finale, something that would reclaim her power in one dramatic strike. And so, she hatched a reckless plan to file a lawsuit, personally, against Mark and his family. Her claim was absurd. She accused them of defamation, of conspiring to ruin her reputation, of orchestrating the sabotage video. She filed papers at the courthouse, convinced that dragging Mark into a public legal battle would intimidate him into retreat. But Karen underestimated one thing: Mark's resolve. He wasn't just defending a ramp anymore, he was defending his family's right to live in peace. His lawyer countered swiftly, not only dismantling her claims, but filing a countersuit for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. The evidence was overwhelming: letters, fines, reports, vandalism, and above all, the security footage. The court case never made it far. Within weeks, a judge dismissed Karen's claims as baseless and ordered her to pay legal fees. Worse for Karen, the countersuit remained active. For the first time, consequences loomed over her in a way she couldn't control or intimidate her way out of. News of the court's decision spread quickly. Karen's reputation, once merely bruised, was now shattered beyond repair. No one in the neighborhood respected her, no one feared her, and no one wanted anything to do with her. Her house, once immaculate, became overgrown as she neglected it, too consumed by bitterness to care. Eventually, the inevitable happened. A for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. Quietly, without ceremony, she packed up her things and left the neighborhood she had once ruled like a queen. The empire she built on fear and control had crumbled into nothing. When the moving truck finally drove away, the neighbors gathered in relief. Some cheered, others simply sighed, but everyone knew a chapter had closed. For the first time, the street felt free. Mark stood at the base of the ramp with Ryan, watching as the last traces of Karen disappeared down the road. Ryan looked up at his father, a small smile forming on his face. The ramp still stood, solid and unshakable, not just as wood and nails but as a symbol of resilience. The battle had been long, exhausting, and often terrifying. But in the end, Mark's family hadn't just won their fight, they had changed the neighborhood. They had shown everyone that standing up to a bully was possible, even when that bully hid behind rules and authority. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the ramp, Mark felt something he hadn't in months. Peace. The war was over. The ramp had stayed. And Karen was gone. Osivo was gone.